But thank you so much for coming in for this lecture today. The Visiting Artist Lectures series is generously sponsored by, with the assistance of the Agnes Kroll Blackburn Visiting Artists and Scholars Fund and the Elise Zeller-Sauer Fund for the Fine Arts. So we thank them dearly for being able to host a lecture series that runs throughout the year at the School of Art. Today we have Jaclyn Wright, who's here today. She's a visiting artist. She's been here for a whole year. If you're a graduate student, I recommend you contacting her and set up a studio visit. She's here driving 2 days a week from Indianapolis, so you have to schedule far enough in advance so she can visit. Okay, great. Jaclyn Wright was born in Peoria, Illinois. She received a Bachelor's of Arts from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, in cinema and photography in 2009. She went on to get her Master of Fine Arts in Photography at Indiana University in 2013. She's also studied at the Hospital Field House Art Center in Arbroath, Scotland, and Kyoto University in Art of Design in Kyoto, Japan. In 2013, she was the recipient of a Fine Art Project grant from Indiana University and a finalist for the Georgia Fee Artist Writer Residency in Paris, France. Her work has been shown nationally, internationally, and has been featured on several internet galleries and blogs. She's currently visiting artist, as I said. I would like to just read a brief quote, from her. Much like an archaeologist collecting artifacts, she's been collecting and cataloging her own experiences in an attempt to preserve them. I think you'll enjoy watching this lecture for sure as much as I will. Please give a round of applause for Jaclyn Wright for being here. Thank you.
Hello? Hello? Is it on? Okay. So, thanks for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. So far this semester, it's been a real pleasure to work with some of the DAP students. It's been a really great experience, and I'm very excited to be here and share my work with you guys today. Before I get started, just if anyone has comments or questions as I go through slides, please don't, feel free to interrupt me at any point. I'm happy to ask them along the way so that we don't have to do it all at the end. But feel free to ask whenever. So, the title of my talk is Nothing and Everything, and that is for several reasons. Over the past few years, my work has significantly changed, as really has my view on photography. And it's changed in the way that I approach making images and really changed the outcome of the type of work that I produce. But the underlying concept or point of interest for me always seems to stay fairly constant, and that is that I tend to gravitate towards the idea that I can understand or try to understand the need to comprehend existence and really examine the tools that we use to try and validate this need. So for instance, everyone or a lot of people collect objects and mementos in order to sort of have a memory of someone or something. So I also think that existence can be sort of problematic and challenging, and that's because we're always trying, and because of that, we're always trying to prove ourselves or prove that our self is necessary and valuable. We seem to constantly be striving to better understand our place and our function within this space that we inhabit. And when I say inhabit, I don't necessarily mean our house or a dwelling, but more of a metaphorical space that surrounds us. So the work that I'm going to show today covers a few major concepts, and the first set of images, which I'm going to go through pretty quickly, sort of is based on the existentialist idea of other. The second project is based on the types of objects we collect and surround ourselves with, which is one of the more recent projects I've been working on. And the final set of images are influenced by the psychological desire to have a certain state of mind. So, to get started, can't tell if that looks right. Okay. So this leads me into the first project, which like I said, I'm going to go through pretty quickly. So, and really just use it as a jumping off point to sort of show the shift into the newer work. And this was the work that I created while I was in graduate school, which really wasn't that long ago. So at the time, or really, I guess, backing up further, like 4 years ago, I was really attached to the process of image making, specifically traditional processes, So I was shooting with a large format camera, processing my film, making darkroom prints, and I think a lot of that has to do with my education because I attended a very technically intensive undergraduate school. So I wasn't particularly concerned with the conceptual aspects of image making as I was with making a really solid and technically sound image. At the time, I really liked the nature of shooting with a large format camera. I felt like it slowed me down. It made me consider each camera movement, compositional element, and required me to become really observant of everything that was around me. So with that being said, I don't really want to dwell on the technical process too much, but I think it's important to point out because once I stopped focusing on that aspect in my work, that's when the shift really started to happen, which I'll get to in a minute. So at the time, I had mentally given myself a set of constraints to work within due to the way that I was choosing to make images, and not so much because of the way I was choosing to think about them. And as I said, the project was based on the existentialist idea of other, which allowed me to examine myself through the sort of guise of a third person. And I'm not sure if anyone has heard this Sartre example, often used to clarify other, but he describes a scenario where a man is looking through a keyhole and becomes completely immersed in the situation that's happening in the room in front of him. And then he suddenly hears a creak in the floor and becomes aware of himself seen by other. And at this, he's filled with shame because he's able to perceive himself as he would perceive someone being a peeping Tom. So I became really fascinated by this notion that I could simultaneously see and be seen. And I felt I was able to do so through photography because I took the photograph, I was a part of the photograph, and I sort of had an experience in that moment. But then later, when I would view the images, I no longer felt that sort of connection to it. So the sort of experience and interaction no longer really felt like they were mine. So to sort of shift gears, once I graduated, I sort of had finished this work and decided I needed to move on and try something else. And at this point, I had decided to go to Japan for several months. And here you'll start to see sort of a clear shift. Excuse me. So the work began to shift, but also my perspective on photography began to change. And I don't think it was necessarily because I was in Japan, but it was because I was in a new environment and forced to think very differently. And while I was there, I became fascinated by these really elaborate protective structures that were all over the Japanese landscape. The structures were often made of wood and cloth and rock and wooden beams and twine and so forth. So, I don't know if anyone's been to Japan, but they are very thoughtful and meticulous in everything that they do. So this sort of became very evident in the environment as well for me. So just sort of a little insight into how they do these things. So there are several different types of structures used depending on the need of the environment. So for example, in this image, you'll see the trees are wrapped with plastic and duct tape in order to suffocate the infestation that's in the trees. So this was to save the trees as opposed to just chopping them down and wiping out whole areas of plant life. And another example, this is called a komomaki, which is one of the more commonly seen protective structures. The belts are put on the trees to sort of trick the pest, which is a pine pest or a moth, into doing something that it wouldn't normally do. And that is that the caterpillars would typically make their way to the ground and bury themselves in the fallen leaves. But the komomaki offers a sort of straw matting where they can settle for the winter. So this makes it easy to eliminate them in the spring, so the gardeners just remove the mats along with the pests and burn them. So yeah, I mean, it's very functional, but also very visually attractive. So, the designs are very visually appealing due to the sort of sculptural aspects of them. And I began to photograph them and view them as objects separate from their original purpose. And the extent to which the Japanese preserve and control the landscape is really, as I said, unique to their culture and really makes the Japanese aesthetic very evident. So at the time, I was also researching and sifting through Library of Congress archives. I had begun to collect images that I found to be visually appealing, and at the time I was really influenced by Larry Sultan and Mike Mindell's Project Evidence. Any of you have seen that work? And I was drawn to the very minimalist approach of documenting the objects and found myself recreating this very raw photographic look. Objects were often placed in the middle of the frame, tightly cropped, so there was no real outside context given to the piece. It sort of stood there alone and was, what it was. And then also there was often like a human appendage would sort of show up and appear in the frame in order to really just give the objects more dimensionality. And I found this to be very visually interesting and well, and it offered a different way to examine the piece. And I was also interested in the idea that these objects were being photographed with the sole purpose to later just be viewed as a realistic representation of something that existed. And then, in viewing these images outside of their original context, so by pulling them from the archives and sort of shuffling them into my own categories, it really allowed me to deconstruct their purpose and their function. So now I'm getting back into, from the archives, some of my own images, and my interest in the archives and the Japanese aesthetic led me to begin photographing a series of objects meant to mimic the way the Japanese manipulated the landscape. I became very meticulous in my technique, and in addition to using things like burlap and twine and bamboo that I found, I began to also find Japanese silks and delicately woven fabric to further represent the sort of cautious and attentive nature of the culture. So this set was the first series of images I made incorporating the formal qualities I was interested in, influenced by the Japanese aesthetic. And at the time I was using materials collected just from walking around or going to parks or thrift stores and things, and deconstructing those and then reconstructing them to create these sculptural objects. So that leads me into how I came to make this series that I'm going to talk about called Artifacts. So during the second month of my stay in Japan, I began to make images for this project, as I mentioned. And by the time I returned to the States, I was pretty invested in further creating this work. So at this point, the project became sort of shifted from thinking about the way the Japanese manipulated the landscape, and it became a lot more personal. It made me think about the ways in which all cultures and individuals place significance on particular objects and philosophies. So the images shifted from using objects found in the environment to using objects of personal significance. And I began to really look at my practice from an archaeological perspective. I began to collect and catalog artifacts as a means for preservation and then later observation. Do these look pixelated? They shouldn't. They're really large files. Sorry about that. Okay, so I began, because I was approaching the personal subject matter through a systematic perspective, I really wanted to strike a balance between the personal and clinical view that I was dealing with. So by doing so, I felt like I was able to decontextualize and deconstruct the significance of each individual piece outside of its original sort of purpose. And this image is a really good example of connecting the clinical to the personal. So, little personal tidbit. I found this bag, which had the little eyelash in it. in a box of purses, like shoved in a corner of the box that was going to be thrown away from my grandmother's house after she had passed away. And she was kind of a hoarder, so there was like lots of these boxes. And I began sort of sifting through them, and I found this. So I felt like I was able to look at this from a really investigative perspective, while it still remained very personal to me. And the object, or the eyelash in it, became sort of a remnant for me of her existence. And after I discovered the eyelash, I really began to think about sort of all of the things that we leave behind that are very sort of like unimportant, like hair. And it made me think about this example. So I visited the Lilly Library, which is this really wonderful library at Indiana University. And at the time, there was a Sylvia Plath installation, and the library had a lock of her hair incorporated into the show. And everyone around me was very excited about this and thought this was this wonderful thing. And I started to realize that the lock of hair was really just symbolic, and further sort of provided proof for them of her existence. And the idea that the hair could shift something from meaning absolutely nothing that you find on the ground or in your bathroom to symbolizing everything about an individual was really interesting. And the fact that the piece of hair really only became significant after death. I also began to photograph in a way that I could neutralize particular locations or objects by removing them from their original context. So for this example, this is an image of an incoming tide on Miyajima. It's an island in Japan. I'm sorry, those are so pixelated, they look terrible. And it's really famous for its floating torii, and it has a really bright orange temple. But none of those signifiers are in this image, so once they're removed, it becomes no more significant than an image like this, which is just a small swimming hole in the middle of nowhere in Virginia. So I was really excited about making two things that are, on different sides of the world, become very neutralized and have a really wonderful resemblance. And this image is another attempt at sort of merging the personal with an anthropological perspective. So I also began to compare the objects in a way, again, to further deconstruct their actual purpose. And I did so by photographing objects like this swim cap, that's purpose is very clear, and then would place it next to an image like this, which becomes very indecipherable. And you'll probably notice this image is pretty similar to the archival image I showed of the gloves. And the reason for that is I really wanted to reproduce images that I found while searching the archives, but instead of just appropriating them, I decided to use objects of personal significance and just sort of rephotograph the simplicity of the image. So ostensibly, I'm making these images in or for contemporary art, but I am attracted to the possibility that the images at some point could become a part of an archival collection from which I sort of drew the inspiration for the project. So that leads me, the last project or the last series of work I'm going to discuss is a project I've recently really just been working on for probably about a month. And it's titled eudaimonia. I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with this term. So I'll just briefly define it. Etymologically, it consists of the words eu, meaning good, and daimon, meaning spirit. So eudaimonia is a Greek philosophical term used to describe human flourishing or well-being, in short, happiness. But really means much more than that. So how I became interested in this topic was after a quick Google search, I had come across tons and tons and tons of articles and websites, and I had found like 5 podcasts in a single week of driving here and back that all were obsessed with this sort of ideal of happiness. And they featured psychologists and scientists and researchers, all of whom were trying to find ways to sort of track and quantify this data. And at the same time, they were supplying information on ways to boost your neurotransmitters and your endorphins and sort of lead a more fulfilling life. And I began to really think about this and believe that this sort of like cult of positive thinking can really lead to callousness and often make people feel ashamed to experience emotions such as anxiety. But I really think it's important to not numb yourself to the negative emotions. And so the series is not about happiness, but more an observation or an exploration into the sort of strategies and philosophies taken in hope of evading a really unhappy existence and the obsessive culture that goes along with that. So it's an attempt to collect and create a comprehensive guide to finding or figuring out this great secret. But really the problem is that the concept is completely elusive. It offers no satisfactory answers and will bring no peace of mind, because after all, happiness is subjective. So just a few research examples. So while I was researching, I came across a website dedicated to this study, and it was called Emotionally Vague, so very cheesy as well. But they conducted studies about emotions and the body's physical response, and I'm sure many of you saw a month ago or whatever, there's those images floating around on Facebook and Tumblr, thermal images where they would say, if you experienced happiness, where would it be? If you experienced anger in your body, where would it be? And so on. So this particular project that I found was dedicated to similar types of studies, and I've been pulling a lot of information from them to create images. So in this example, the color chart, which of course is based on a photographic color chart, is done from a study asking participants to choose colors in response to the word joy. So from the top left to right and down is sort of the top to bottom responses of these colors. And then in another way, I realized that eudaimonia can really be explained through scientific research, which is a way that a lot of scientists are trying to quantify the information because it involves a lot of chemicals in the brain. So in order to have an actual scan to work with and be able to manipulate, I had my brain scanned at the Science and Imaging Center at Indiana University. We have a really great facility. And so I did so in order to sort of make work based on that approach or that aspect of the work. So, and the way that I've approached this project is a little different than I have other ones in the past, and that is that it's supposed to be very comprehensive in the way that I'm going to show it. So I've been, again, collecting graphs and taking surveys and putting prompts onto Craigslist, which have generated really sort of intriguing and also very bizarre and weird responses. So in this example, I found several charts that were dedicated to time of day corresponding to the happiness level. So in other research, I've found sort of lists of countries ranked based on happiness and based on these sort of issues. And I found that the major problem with trying to sort of quantify or track this data is that it's really impossible to compare an individual's well-being based solely on monetary concerns or standards of living or the government, for that matter. So really making a comparison between a developed and a developing country seems not very, like it's not very productive. So in this example, you'll see all of the countries that are listed, if you can read any of those, which are mostly Northern European countries, United States, Canada, and a few Western European countries. And that's the whole area that it's from. And African and Middle Eastern countries aren't represented at all on this list, and they really aren't on any chart until like the very, very bottom. And I think the problem with this is that it's impossible, as I said, to sort of quantify an entire country's well-being when really it can only be really truly observed by a person-to-person basis. So I'm not suggesting that the fixation is entirely negative, but I think it's important to look at the absurdity of the problem that many people are becoming obsessed with. And I think, if we can begin to measure someone's happiness, it seems like we're maybe numbing the method to obtaining it. And I think, after all, a degree of discomfort is really a precondition of our ability to really experience eudaimonia. So with that, that's it. I'm really sorry again that the images were pixelated. I'm not sure why. They don't seem to be on any other screen. So if you would like to see the images on a smaller screen, I'd be happy to show you. And with that, I would like to open it up for any questions that you might have. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could talk about that, not necessarily in the context that you did with the shift in the practical aspect of what Japan brought on,
Right.
but more in the philosophical approaches to image making that seem so apparently different
Yeah.
in your regular work.
Yeah, definitely. I think part of it definitely has to do with my education, and that is, as I sort of mentioned, like, it wasn't something that was required of me ever. So all that was required of me, at least in undergrad, was to make really nice-looking images. So I became very good at making really nice-looking images and not ever having to conceptually address why. And then once I got to graduate school, I honestly didn't feel pushed that much to elaborate any more on that. And in my particular experience, I had a really wonderful opportunity to meet a few people who came into the program who were shifted, or who really shifted my way of thinking, because they were very research intensive. And I'd never really experienced that firsthand before, so it became something that was like, oh, why have I not done this? Like, why is this not something that people are being told to do, that you should have a really, whether the work is emotional or personal, it should also be very analytical in a sense, and you should know what you're researching and thinking about. So towards my last year of school, that's when I really started to think about it. And then I realized at the end of graduate school that I felt like I was just making pretty pictures. And I found that very disheartening and disappointing, that I had been in school for 7 years for this thing, and all I had to sort of speak for it was pretty pictures. So at that point, I sort of like threw all of my notions of photography and my thought process and the way that I approached it in the garbage, basically, and felt like I had to start from scratch, which is what I did. And I sort of allowed myself to just like read a lot and write a lot and think about what photography meant to me as a practice and as a medium, and the context of it within the art world. And from that, I think that's really where the shift happened for me mentally. And then I was able to approach actual image making in a way that seemed more productive for the way that contemporary art is. So, yeah. Yeah. Right.
and making art to be looked at, to be questioned, to be thought about.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like that comes hand in hand with this like intensive research.
Yeah.
With having a real kind of goal-driven place that you want the work to be.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that that's the case. I feel like before, when I was making work, there was no goal. It was just merely image making. But I think once you start doing the research and thinking about it and how it relates to just like society or the world or in relation to contemporary art, you mentally just have to approach it differently. It can't just be a documentation of something unless that is the purpose of the work. So I think it's really just about, for me, it's about being informed about what I'm doing and what that means in the greater sort of context.
It just seems like it was spoken about differently, where at the beginning you were talking about how, and today you're talking about why.
Yeah, and I think that has to do with where the shift took place, just for me, and again in the work. So yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, yeah. Other questions?
Do you think about exploring this, like, from the standpoint of going back to Kyoto, and their view of, like, patenting versus more of a meditative state versus...
Yeah, I've thought a lot about a lot of different things with this project because it's sort of like very vague in some sense, and I feel like happiness is really cliche in a lot of ways, which is not the way that I'm trying to approach it. So I think, yeah, revisiting or sort of really looking at countries and how they approach things like that and what that means is really important. I think eventually this project will become very, I am very open to understanding other cultures' sort of means to get to that point in their life. So yeah, I think I would really like to go back to Japan anyway, because it's a really bizarre and wonderful place. So yeah, I think it's definitely something worth that I'll probably explore in the future. Yeah.
Another thing that you did remarkably well, that I think is something that's really valuable to have, that, again, we want to hear about, is the newer projects, starting with the Japan work and even more aggressively towards the newest project, have a shocking aesthetic breadth
Mm-hmm.
in strategy, implementation, and function of that aesthetic,
Right.
whereas the older work was a lot more rigid.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could, because I think one of the things that happens, particularly with a lot of younger artists, is this desire to develop style.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you can talk about, because I'm assuming that was something that at some point difficult to grapple with, because the Japan work was clearly a body of work in transition.
Mm-hmm.
Aesthetically from your previous projects to your later projects, I think it reflected the tight composition and
Mm-hmm.
almost like the earlier work, while gesturing towards like contemporary European photography and then
Yeah.
on towards where you're headed down. I'm wondering if you can discuss the struggle, maybe,
Yeah.
of breaking apart from style and sort of venturing out into movement.
Yeah, it definitely was a struggle. When I graduated, and I had almost immediately, like from my thesis show to the time I arrived in Japan was maybe 3 weeks. And at the time, I had heard all these terrible stories of people who graduated and like never touched a camera, never made work again. So part of the reason I went to Japan was so that I did not have that opportunity to slack off or have a lag between making work, so I could just sort of go head first. And doing so, I knew that I wanted to make different work. And while I was in Japan, I struggled quite a bit because I often would find myself making images, even though they were all digital and felt very different in like the process aspect, that looked very similar. And every time I made those, I felt like in my head I was saying, like, why are you doing this? You know this is not what you want to do. This looks really like cheesy. And so I think I started mentally like beating myself up a little bit when I did make those images, and which of course felt really terrible at times, but I think that really helped me to feel okay with leaving that behind. And then by the time I came back, I just had no desire to make images that looked like that, and I still don't. If I even have the thought in my head like, oh, I could make an image like this, I just sort of cut myself off. and don't allow it. But I think definitely like the 3 weeks between and then at least the first month and a half of being in Japan, it was definitely like constantly reminding myself that that was not the direction I wanted to go in. It just came very naturally because I'd been doing it for so long. So it was definitely a hard habit to break, but I think I was determined mentally to not have it continue. So, and I think that's really key in having your work shift, because I think a lot of times students especially will try to break what they're doing, but they end up just falling back into the same old habits. So it's a matter of determination to really rid yourself of those.
Yeah, I mean, your trajectory from Japan was what, like 10 months ago?
Yeah.
Yeah, the trajectory from Japan to the Newman's work is really nothing short of remarkable, given it was to sum up 7 years of your previous practice of being.
Yeah.
I think really that's awesome.
Yeah. It feels really weird to be able to do that, but I definitely don't feel bad about it. It feels like really liberating in a sense.
Yeah, a lot of those skills I think that are foundational and come through in the detail.
Hmm. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah. You mean like keeping me working? I think so. I think I would have done it anyway. I don't really have a slacker mentality. I have a really hard time sitting still for like more than a day without working. I just feel like really poorly about it. But I think going there and forcing myself into a new environment, especially one that I was completely unfamiliar with. I'd never been to an Asian country at all. So I had no idea what to expect. There's huge language barriers. So I think just sort of like taking myself out of this very comfortable place and putting myself in this entirely new experience really was just the extra little like kick I needed. So yeah, I think it was a good strategy in that sense. Yeah.
I guess I'm verify. You're talking about creating images or things about making an image.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I guess a lot of the later work is more like found, or maybe like not necessarily like you found an image, but you like have to perform it, or instead of like artificially constructing it. Is that the difference? Or I just feel like that.
No, that I would not say that is difference, because there is still a bit of construction that happens. But I think I've found a way to do it where it doesn't seem as contrived. There are some things that are happened upon, of course. But I think for me, what I meant by that was, in making the images, I was so obsessed with like the camera I was using and the film I was using and the compositional elements of like what an image was supposed to look like. And also, as I think Jordan pointed out, it became very, I felt the need to have a very stylized look. Even if it was subconscious, I can look back on that now and understand that. And so the shift was really to sort of abandon all of those things. And then the image making just became more natural. So I wasn't afraid to walk around and photograph something or go into the studio and set something up and try it 1,000 different ways. So I think in that way I still am, manipulating things, but in a way that is not so contrived. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
It seems like some of the earlier images, they had a sort of like Walter Heavy, like dead and kind of descriptive aesthetic, which like that seems to be shared in the archival images that you were interested in.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like as the work progressed, the complexity of some of the devices also sort of increased.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like compositionally, I was wondering if like what sort of like caused that like scheme or approach into your real life. Like maybe it's all happening culminated at once.
No, that's kind of a hard question to answer. I think really what started the still lifes, or I was also, I guess, really another shift that I should point out is I was looking at very different work. I had shifted, I had looked at a lot of traditional, very, very traditional, well-known photographers, and all of a sudden came into this world that I was really disappointed no one had showed me prior, where people were just making very different types of images. So I think in that, I was very inspired and influenced by a lot of contemporary photographers, where before, my only real jumping off point was these very traditional types of image making techniques. So I think that has a lot to do with it as well. And just sort of like pushing the boundaries of what I expected out of a still life or out of an image. And I think that's where I started to try and be a little bit more complex in the way that I was making the image and the type of things that I was doing to create it. I don't know if that answered your question. Okay. Uh-huh. Anyone else? No? Thank you.